Welcome to Chris Horner's Corner. In today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about heat training. Now, I got an article sent over to me from email from Ted, one of the viewers of Beyond the Coverage and Butterfly Effect and all that stuff, and he wanted to know my take on the heat training and what I thought about the article after I replied back to him. Well, first off, if everybody watches the channel, I've been watching it for the last 4 years, I am a big advocate for heat training. I loved heat training. I was one of the few cyclists in the professional peloton that once it got into the 40 degrees Celsius, so we're talking about over 100 degrees, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, we're talking about some warm weather, I always still got excited. I loved the heat. I performed well in the heat. I didn't have a drop in performance like if you go in and watch the GCN video here from Connor Dunn, where he had a 50% drop. Now he's over, I assume he's in England, dropped over there to the performance lab and jumped in and did testing in extreme heat, 40 Celsius, for 1 hour, and he lost about 50% of his power. We're talking about going from 259 watts down to 134 watts. He lost a ton of power in a 1 hour period. So if you look at that, sometimes you might think, well, heat's bad training for you. Then if you watch the video, you see a little bit further in there, and they kind of reinforce some of the stories I've told you throughout the Butterfly Effect and Beyond the Coverage about how much I prefer heat training over altitude training. If I take you just back to a couple weeks before the 24 Tour de France, when I was Jonas Vingegaard going up to altitude training, I told you I thought it was dangerous for Jonas Vingegaard to be going up to altitude training and then coming ready for the Tour de France in such a short period of time after the crash at the Basque Country. That means he only had a few weeks of solid training. So if you're up at altitude and it snows on you, if the roads get icy, if it rains, it's harder to train. It becomes more difficult versus if you're in the heat. Well, I always got those same kind of benefits, I thought, of leaning out, getting thinner, getting faster, getting better. And then later when you watch the GCN video, you'll see where it says that the actual hemoglobin starts to produce and you get a 4% bump in hemoglobin if you're training in the heat, like Jonas Vingegaard was getting in altitude training. That's always what I thought. I never did the testing to figure out what my hemoglobin looked like when I was down in San Diego training in 95, 105 degree weather there when I was east of San Diego in the mountains there of Santee and Lakeside and Ramona area where it was screaming hot out there. But I always knew that every time, the more time I spent in heat, the better I got. Now again, if you go back to the video, the trainer there, Lindsay, where we're talking about the precision, hydration, and fuel, well, he's saying that you need about 14 days. And I agree with him. Every time you can get more acclimated to the heat, just like the altitude, you're going to start to get better and better. But the only difference is in heat, you don't have bad weather to affect your training. I think the most important thing when you're talking about getting fitter is, of course, repetitive training. Coming in there day to day. Just like Lindsay said. He said he always sees the number and normally arrive at 50% for the first time an athlete comes in there and does that 1 hour test in 40 degree weather. But then as they start coming more and more, that of course gets better. It's always going to get better more as you adapt to something. But when we're talking about heat, you need to be careful, especially extreme heat. I never went down and just wanted to start from kilometer zero and just do a big training ride in massive heat. Otherwise, like we saw there with Connor, where he dropped 2 liters of water in a 1 hour period, it can get dangerous fast. Anytime you start dropping 2 liters of water, you're never going to be able to replace that fast enough through your ride. So you're always going to be getting more and more dehydrated throughout the ride. Many times when I was in San Diego in the middle of the summer in heat, getting ready for the Tour de France, so we're talking about late June down there, I would get on the scale. I would probably weigh in at about 141, 139 at times, and then you finish a hard day of training, you can come back 3, 4, and even 5 pounds lighter if you're not careful. All the time, 3 pounds was pretty predictable to drop that much, but when you start dropping 5, you start getting into some dangerous levels. So my take when I'm watching the video here is, first off, throughout my whole career, I always knew heat was a big time benefit. Just being able to come leaner, I think the body naturally, as it's warmer out, wants to eat less calories and take on less calories. And I think there's a motivation factor to it when you're out there. Extreme heat's a little bit different when we're talking about over 98 degrees of body temperature. That's when it starts changing, where you might not enjoy the ride so much as you would if it's 85 to 95 degrees. You go out 85, 95, you throw on a pair of shorts, your jersey, you're having a fantastic ride with your buddies. You drop down to the coast, you stop at a coffee place, and you ride back home. It was a magnificent day. You start getting over 95, closer to body temperature, and then you flip the switch and go over body body temperature. We're talking about some extreme training conditions to be in. So you need to be fit to go into those. Now, I don't recommend going in and doing a 1-hour test at 105 degrees. I don't ever recommend going from 0 into that kind of temperature and trying to get fitter day to day under that. I would recommend more that you go outside and you're training in normal conditions under your body temperature, hopefully under 90 degrees even, and you start building your fitness up. And then you start going into those labs, or you start going into your garage and you're turning the heat up. Many times when I was a professional rider, as Garrett will tell you behind the camera, I was on the trainer and he'd open up the door. What would I tell you, Garrett?
Close the door.
Close the door. We live in Bend, Oregon. In the wintertime, it was cold out, so I want the room warm. I would heat up the garage quite a bit and get that up there to the higher 80-degree temperature in the garage, and like training in there. So when the kids would open up the garage, got to the point to where I just have to lock the door, and they knew when it's training time not to open the garage because it would let the heat out. So I do believe in heat for sure, but that extreme training that we're watching in the video, I believe works better if you start coming into that with a little bit of fitness. When we look there and we see Connor doing his testing again, there's GCN commentator, I don't know how much fitness he had going in there. And when we look at the article afterwards in there with Lindsay saying that most of his clients that come in would see that 50% drop, I got to believe they're coming in not 100% fit like a pro rider. Okay, you guys sitting on the Chesterfield watching this video right now, you're not pro, so it is relative to you. But as a pro rider, you would always first want to get the distance of training up and up and up as much as you can. If you're working a 9-to-5 job, you don't have that option. So I do believe there is a window of opportunity there where training in the heat would be better than, of course, training in your garage. But let's say that you could train in your garage and you could save yourself 2 more hours. So let's say you could do a 2-hour ride or a 3-hour ride even, instead of driving in your car, going over to a heat lab and jumping in there where it's 104 degrees and getting an hour. I always believe it's better to do more training than it is less training if you're talking about a significant difference. Now, if I have the choice of training in some warm weather with some fitness, I'm always going to take that first and foremost. But you have to be very careful once you start going over that 90-degree body temperature. And certainly, even if you're not really fit or you're carrying some extra kilos on you, you have to be very careful when the temperature's starting to get over 90 degrees. Now, earlier this season, I had Garrett training. He did about 2 months of training in the middle of the season. He did May and June, if I remember correctly. And I had him going up to, what, about 300 miles a week when it was all said and done, right?
Yeah.
So he's doing up to about 300 miles a week. And one day he told me, he said, tomorrow I want to go do a 100-mile ride. And I looked at him, I said, no. You don't want to do a 100-mile ride when it's 100 degrees out. You're not quite ready for that yet. That's extreme temperatures to be doing a jump like that. Because we're talking about a 5.5, 6-hour ride for a newbie that just started riding. Garrett's never ridden his bike really in the past. Consecutively, those 2 months is the longest he's ever ridden his bike for. Before that, there was never a time where he'd ridden his bike for more than a week at a time, ever. So his experience was completely new. And when he talked about doing a 100-mile ride, his first 100-mile ride in 100-degree weather, I immediately put the blocks on that and said, no way, don't do it. It's not an intelligent move. You have to be very experienced going into 100-degree plus temperatures, and especially when you're going to be in there for multiple hours. As we saw the GCN commentator, Connor there, once he drops 50% of power, that's in 1 hour. 1 hour loss of 50% power, that's massive. So if Garrett was to go out there and do a 100-mile ride and be out there for 5.5, probably turn it into a 6.5-hour ride because he'd lose so much power and then, of course, be cramping at some point in time, as we saw in the video again with Connor cramping when he was doing the gravel event, 200-mile unbound gravel event there. That's what I could foresee would happen to Garrett out there training in his first 100-degree day. You want to work your way up. You don't want to go from 0 to hero. If you're going from a really cold place into a very hot place, then certainly some kind of adaptation would be nice to take on if you can. But the most important thing that you have to remember if you're changing a big-time climate difference is your overall fitness needs to be the best. So if you asked me, would 1 hour training be better than a 3-hour training ride in the cold, I'd take the 3-hour training ride in the cold every day of the week. There's no doubt about it. But at some point in time, you have to understand that if you're going to go from cold to extreme heat or from 0 altitude to 5,000, 6,000 feet, there's always going to be more taxing put on your body to be able to do that. And a little adaptation always helps. The one thing I take out of the story, though, is, well, they agree that heat is absolutely a fantastic tool. I believe in it 100%. If you can find it, go get it. You will enjoy it. You will always get better and faster, but never go from zero to hero. That is the mistake that a lot of athletes make when they first start their training. Zero to hero in anything, whether if it's zero temperature or going into 40 degrees Celsius temperature or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a dangerous thing to do, so you got to work your way into it. Don't go in there and try to do your first 100-mile ride in 100-degree weather ever. Hope you guys like my take here. Hope you guys tune in for some more. Like and subscribe, and I'll bring you some more videos in the near future.